mysterious case of Edward LaPierre. Is there any more appropriate or convenient place to die than at a cemetery? On the night of November 29, 1895, Edward LaPierre, age 45, was found lying dead of a gunshot wound at the north end of Silverbrook Cemetery. Though his death was ruled a suicide, strange circumstances caused many to question this ruling. Edward LaPierre owned a jewelry store on Main Street near 3rd in downtown Niles. An ad for his store describes his merchandise: diamonds, watches, silverware, and all goods usually found in a high-class jewelry establishment, gold pens and toothpicks, gold spectacles, gold-headed canes, and also fine china. His store is a model of neatness and convenience, centrally located, and is patronized by the best families in the city and surrounding country. In 1880, an armed robbery was attempted at LaPierre's jewelry store. On December 1st, 2 masked men entered the store with drawn revolvers. LaPierre's partner, Mr. Mick, was behind the counter. Mr. LaPierre was in the back room. Mr. Mick made a move for one of the thief's guns, while LaPierre managed to grab his own revolver. In the scuffle, one of the robbers shot twice at LaPierre. LaPierre shot back and wounded one of the men. Both criminals managed to escape. A short time later, LaPierre was walking home when he encountered the man he had shot lying on the ground. LaPierre recognized him and the police hauled him away. His partner escaped but was arrested in Chicago a short time later. Mick and LaPierre were lauded for defending their store. The headline read, "Hell's Angels. Ed LaPierre feeds one of them on lead bullets, the other escapes." 15 years later, near the anniversary of this fateful night, Edward went home as usual. At the supper table, he ate heartily, but appeared melancholy, yet not unusually so. After supper, he visited the home of Mr. Henry Lardner, and after a short chat, he said goodbye. He visited his store again and saw his son, Guy LaPierre, who assumed his father was headed home. Mr. Lardner came down to the store at about 8 and asked for Edward, telling Guy that his father had called at his house and seemed agitated. Not finding his father at home, Guy went to the cemetery with a Dr. Clark. Edward had been in the habit of going through the cemetery on moonlit nights, often remarking that the cemetery was a beautiful place. Guy and Dr. Clark looked around and, on top of the steps at the north entrance, discovered the lifeless body of Edward, lying in a natural position with both hands crossed over his breast and the right hand grasping a .38 caliber revolver. A bullet hole pierced his right temple, 1¼ inches above his ear. Did Edward suffer from, as one paper called it, a mental aberration? What was his mental state that night? A year earlier, both Edward's mother and father died within a month of each other in Edward's house. Edward's father, Amable LaPierre, was a mason in South Bend and worked on buildings for Notre Dame. He later moved to Niles and assisted freedom seekers, offering them food and buying railroad tickets to Canada. His involvement eventually landed him as a defendant in the South Bend fugitive slave case of 1850. A Kentucky slave owner was seeking the return of 6 enslaved people whom LaPierre had helped flee to Canada. The judgment against LaPierre forced him to sell all of his property. In addition to mourning his parents, some friends mentioned Edward was worried about the armed robbery which had taken place 15 years earlier at his store, especially as the anniversary of the date approached. In April of that year, a house he owned caught fire. Mr. LaPierre's face was burned as he was trying to extinguish the fire. It was also noted that he had suffered from a stomach ailment for a long time. Other reports say he appeared to be in the best spirits, and there was no indication that he had any thought of doing any rash act. And, if he had shot himself, why was he found positioned with his arms crossed over his chest? The papers covered his services in dramatic fashion. The funeral was held under the auspices of the Blue Lodge of Masons with a Knights Templar escort of 44 swords. Headed by the Niles City Band, the column marched from their hall to the home of their departed brother at the corner of Broadway and Fifth, where a short service was read by Reverend R. H. F. Gardner. Covering the handsome black casket were exquisite floral pieces from friends, emblematic, we might say, of love and friendship. He was left to rest at Silverbrook until the final summons of that great day is heard. After Edward's death, his son Guy ran the family business until 1909 when he retired. W. A. Thayer, who held a position as a watchmaker and jeweler at the store for 2.5 years, took over the store. Thayer's jewelry store closed in the early 2000s, but the mystery of Edward LaPierre's death remains.